I'll hand over to Julia to introduce herself.
Hello everybody, so I'm Julia Kragulj. I'm the Safeguarding Advisor at TLM England and Wales, and yeah, really looking forward to sharing with you and hearing your thoughts this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, so Julia and I have put together some slides. Cindy has control of the slides, so she's now put that up on the screen. Feel free to send us your questions. If you want to use the chat box, please do. Otherwise, we will pause every once in a while to just check in and find out if you have any questions. And when we get to the end, we'll check again with you if you have any questions or comments. Okay, so we were asked to talk about HR's role in safeguarding. I think it's no surprise to anyone that HR's role in safeguarding is quite a large role. You are incredibly important as HR managers and HR officers or advisors or recruiting managers when it comes to thinking about safeguarding when you're either recruiting, selecting, inducting, supervising, supporting staff throughout the process that they are with TLM in whatever country you're in. When we're talking about your role, it is not only about staff, but we're also talking about anyone who represents TLM in any capacity. Great. Okay, next slide, please. So the learning objectives of this webinar is to better understand safeguarding and how to carry out your responsibilities, to be able to risk assess when recruiting and selecting candidates, and Julia will run this part of the presentation, be able to apply your safeguarding knowledge to improve HR processes, and to support managers to incorporate safeguarding into, as I mentioned, recruitment, performance management, and safeguarding processes. Next slide, please. The content that we will cover in the presentation is just to get terminology right. I know the word safeguarding is still not quite familiar to many of you, or if it is familiar, that's great. But just to be sure that we know what we're talking about. And then, as I mentioned, assessing risk when recruiting, selecting, and onboarding staff or any representative. To talk a little bit about donor expectations, we need to recognize that donors have certain expectations of what organizations should and shouldn't do. So we need to be familiar with that. HR needs to be in a position to identify safeguarding concerns in organizational performance processes, such as performance management, whistleblowing, grievances, and exit interviews, and a little bit about DFID's due diligence doc. Next slide, please. Okay, so that we're all clear about what we're talking about, what is safeguarding in the international sector? It's when organizations exercise their duty of care to ensure no harm or injury occurs when they come into contact with all people. The word they there is the organizations. Organizations should do this by putting measures in place such as policies, procedures, and improved practice to mitigate against risks. Now you notice the words all people. So before we used to only talk about protecting children or protecting vulnerable people. But now we're using the words all people because we include staff and representatives in the organization as well. So we have a duty of care as an organization to ensure that no harm or injury occurs to them, as well as all those that we may work with either in our programs or in our fundraising or in any of the work that we may be doing. Next slide, please. So this is a little diagram that has been taken by a sort of a child safeguarding guru called Dr. David Finkelhall, who's based in the US. And he has talked about here, and we put it in a pictorial form, preconditions to sexual abuse. So you will see the hurdle, the person on the extreme left, and it's the same person, but We know that there may be people out there who may have a motivation to harm or injure children, vulnerable people, and others. We can't do anything about the fact that they may have a motivation, and they may even be able to overcome their internal inhibitors, so their conscience or their moral values. On the second side, you see that they then actually make a beeline, or they are attracted to organizations that don't have policies, procedures, and good practice, because that means that there is an opportunity for them to carry out their bad intentions or their bad motivation. So therefore, we have to ensure that organizations, so the second hurdle, ensure that they don't create the opportunity, so that they make sure that the hurdles are bigger and larger. Because what will happen is, if the opportunity is created, the third hurdle, and you find that there is poor reporting within the organization, that resistance can be overcome, and those perpetrators get away with it, what will happen is that those perpetrators will end up misusing their power and their position over and over again. So what we have to do as HR managers is go to hurdle 2 and ensure that we have risk assessed the people that we are allowing into the organization, whether in whatever capacity, and ensure that we reduce all opportunities for anyone to misuse their power and position. Next slide, please. So we are talking about a safeguarding framework across the organization. Prevention is key, so you will see that at the top of the cycle. Prevention means, as we mentioned, risk assessment, ensuring you've got policies and procedures in place, ensuring that you have a culture within the organization where everyone is accountable to the organization and the wider leadership, and the leadership is accountable to the staff to ensure it's a safe workplace, as well as there are safe work practices. We also have to ensure the second block is reporting. We have to ensure there is a clear reporting mechanism, that it's easily accessible to both staff and all those who come in contact with the organization. So whether it's the beneficiary group, it's the clients in the hospital, it's the people in the community if you're doing outreach work. Response is how the organization responds to the reports that come in, whether they are by way of complaints or suggestions or actual safeguarding concerns. The organization needs to be able to respond appropriately. They need to be able to respond timely to these concerns. Response can also include investigations. So some concerns will require internal investigation. And finally, learning. We need to keep learning from whether it's a near miss or whether it's an actual safeguarding concern. We need to learn from this so that we can incorporate the recommendations back into prevention in order to prevent this from happening again. You will see in the middle the victim-centered approach. So no longer should we be looking only at, the name and reputation of the organization or name and reputation of the leadership. The expectation in 2020 and beyond is that we take a victim-centered approach. What is in the best interest of the victim or victims? Sometimes we use the word survivor. So it all depends on how they perceive themselves. But the question we should be asking is, what is in the best interest of victims and survivors of the alleged abuse or injury that has occurred? Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over now to Julia, who will talk you through risk management. Risk management is key in your HR role, and we have developed a case scenario that she will talk through on how to develop a risk assessment around this. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks, Aneeta. So yes, A couple of weeks ago, we did a webinar about safeguarding risk assessment and management, which some of you may have had the chance to listen to, in which case this will already feel a little bit familiar. If not, then you might find it useful to listen to that at some point. But today we're just looking at a very specific kind of risk assessment, and that's to do with staff recruitment. If you could next slide, please. Oh no, leave that one. So just a few terms. So risk means the potential for something to go wrong, and risk management is the whole process of identifying the potential for something to go wrong. So if recruitment doesn't go well, then thinking about how likely it is to happen and the impact it might have if it did happen, and then taking steps to reduce the possibility of it occurring or its impact if it does occur. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So when we talk about risk mitigation, we're talking about reducing how we reduce the likelihood or the impact of risks. And risk assessments and risk management can help us in all kinds of situations to make better informed decisions and to better manage complex situations. And they can also help us with staff recruitment. And we are piloting at the moment a safeguarding risk assessment and mitigation spreadsheet, which you may have seen that we're finding useful. And it can be useful for your staff recruitment as well. Okay, the next slide, please. So to think through this now, we're just going to use a little scenario. So imagine that you're recruiting for two different positions. One is a finance manager of a TLM hospital, and the other is an outreach worker, so someone working out on the field. And what we want to think about is developing a safeguarding risk assessment for each of those roles that takes account of all the possible risks of these positions and thinks of ways to mitigate those risks. So next slide, please. So first thing we think about is, well, what are the risks associated with each role? What could actually go wrong? And there may be some risks that are the same for both posts, but there might be some risks that apply to one of the roles but not to the other. So I'd just like to open it to you actually for a minute, because please feel free to unmute yourselves, and can you just tell me what you think, what might be some of the risks attached to the role of a hospital finance manager? So over to you.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, this is Bunmi.
Is that Bunmi? Hi, Bunmi.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. To respond to your question, risk associated with recruiting an hospital finance manager, I think the biggest thing I will first look at is whether it is someone that is trustworthy when it comes to handling money, or does he have a good record of maybe wherever he's worked before on how he can do money, or is he someone that will be funneling with money? Because from that we know that this may be pose a risk to us with recruit such an individual. So that may be, yeah, that may not necessarily address risk to children or whatever, but it can lead downwards towards that. If it's someone that has
Yep, thank you, Bunmi. Yes, there's
for a lot of money.
Okay, so yes, so a risk, for a hospital finance manager, if the risk that they would mishandle money and there'd be some kind of financial fraud. Yeah, actually, that's not a direct safeguarding risk, but it is definitely a risk associated with that role. Anybody else want to contribute a risk associated with either of the two roles, the finance manager or the outreach worker?
I'm not sure how big a risk this would be for a finance manager, but for one that works within the hospital, there might also be opportunity to come into contact with people who are vulnerable, like children as well, or adults. Would that be a possible risk?
I think that's a really important risk. If they're a hospital finance manager, although their role doesn't involve direct contact with the patients in the hospital, they very likely have access to large areas of the hospital, so they could come into contact if they chose to do so. So I think that's actually a really important risk to take into account.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment from Natalie, because her network is a little bit poor, that there could also this lead to abuse of other staff as well, I think, by the finance worker.
Absolutely, yep.
Yep.
And it's a position of power, so yes, they could.
Yeah. And patients, yes, as Natalie said as well.
Yep. Okay, how about the outreach worker, somebody working out on the field?
I think for outreach worker, because he works in the field, and sometimes it depends on, maybe if you go to work independently, it's much more, exposed to dealing with people, dealing with vulnerable people, children, and so I think that one is, the risk is much more higher when it comes to outreach worker. He deals directly with people, because if you're doing outreaches, you deal directly with people, and that I think the risk is much more higher in that area, because it's those who are vulnerable is exposed to them, and then children as well, outside, maybe in community, or maybe even the extreme villages that are really, really far away from cities. He goes to others. So I think getting the right person, that is much more of a higher risk, I would say.
Yep, thank you, Bunmi. Yes, I think you're right. This is a role that has direct contact with vulnerable people and children. It can involve, as you said, it can involve lone working, or somebody working alone, sometimes even going into homes. So having a great deal of contact with vulnerable people. So yes, that's a high risk. I think, well, let's move on to the next slide. I just came up with a few possible risks for each position. You've already mentioned some other ones that I didn't come up with. Some are the same. So I think, for both roles, there might be a risk that the individual has been previously implicated in safeguarding, it should say misconduct, apologies, and that you don't pick that up during the recruitment process, which could then have a risk that they then abuse somebody within their new role, and there's a risk to our organizational reputation as well, because we haven't picked up a previous misconduct. And I think that can apply to either. The finance manager is at a senior managerial level, so again, there's a reputational risk if they're implicated in safeguarding misconduct. As you've mentioned, they may have access to all sorts of parts of the hospital. They might have all the keys, so there's a risk of unwitnessed abuse. They might have access to isolated little areas of the hospital. And they're in a senior, powerful position. It might be quite difficult for somebody to raise concerns about their behaviour just because of the power imbalance. So that's a couple of things I came up with. For the outreach worker, as you've said, they have direct contact with beneficiaries, which leads to a risk that they could abuse. And they might be working quite unsupervised and alone. And again, that could be a risk of unwitnessed abuse of a beneficiary or of a colleague. And they have a powerful position with the beneficiaries, with children, with vulnerable people, and it might be very difficult for a beneficiary to feel safe and confident to raise concerns about them. So that's just a few things that I came up with, plus the ones that you came up with. If you were doing this, in real life, you'd probably come up with a much longer list and take a bit of time to do that. So the next slide, please. So what we do next is you take each risk in each role and you think about how likely is it that that will actually take place. And then you think, how bad would it be? What would be the consequences, the impact, if it did actually happen? And then we have a matrix that we use that then grades that and calculates an overall risk level. So could I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry, can we go back?
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, we were a bit late getting our slides together, but it's fine. So we have a matrix, and it works in Excel. And so we rate a likelihood. So if we think it's very unlikely to happen, we give it a score 1 for rare. If it's unlikely, we score it 2. If it's moderately likely, 3. If it's likely, 4. If it's almost certain, then 5. Then we also we rate the impact as insignificant. So the impact would actually be very minor, even if this thing happened. Or it could be minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic. So that if it actually happened, it would be a total disaster. And each of those has a column in the Excel spreadsheet, and then there's a formula that automatically does an overall rating that puts the overall rating as either low, moderate, high, or extreme. So if we just go back a moment to our list of risks. So if we looked at the risk that the hospital manager has been previously implicated in safeguarding misconduct and that this isn't picked up, then we think, so how likely is that to happen? And depending on what we already have in place, we might say, well, we think that's quite unlikely to happen, and we score it a 2, unlikely. Then we say, but what would be the impact if that did happen? If we do recruit this person, and they have actually previously got a record of safeguarding misconduct, and we employ them because we haven't picked this up, what would be the impact? Well, actually, that would be a really, really severe impact. Aha, there it is for us. So I think we'd grade that probably as either major 4 or catastrophic 5. So if we've said the likelihood is 2 and the impact is catastrophic, then if we go up, if we look in the little table, that gives us an overall score of 10, which is yellow, which is high, which means we're rating this as a high risk. And you do the same process for all the different risks. Okay, so can we move on, see what comes next on the slides? So what we do after we've done all of that is we think about mitigating actions for each risk. So that means the ways that we can reduce it. So first of all, we'd ask, what actions do we already have in place? Excuse me. So what are we already doing to make sure this can't happen? If we think about still that risk that somebody has a previous record of safeguarding misconduct, maybe we already ask for references. We already, maybe we already do a police background check on people to find convictions. But then we also might ask, well, what else could we do? Is there more that we could do to reduce that risk? And if there may be, I mean, you're the HR people, I'm not, but maybe if you receive a reference that sounds very neutral, so all it says is this individual worked for us from this date to this date and doesn't say anything else, then maybe that could be a red flag that you think, oh, maybe there's something behind the scenes, and then you have a phone call to the previous employer and ask them, is this person, in your opinion, safe to work with children and vulnerable people? So that could be an additional mitigation. And you go through again this process with all of the risks you've identified. And then you do another grading. So you think, well, if we put all these new mitigations in place, have we changed the likelihood that this thing might go wrong? Do we want to change the grade? Or have we changed the impact? If it did happen, have we made it less severe? And then again, the matrix will calculate a new risk rating that may, if you've got some good new mitigations in place, your risk may have lowered. And then at that point, you think, well, what do we want to do about this? Are we happy to go ahead with the mitigations we've got, or is the risk actually too high and we need to really look at this role again and think how we can make it safe enough for us? So I'm aware that's a really brief introduction to risk assessment in staff recruitment, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how it might work. And I will hand back to Aneeta now.
Thank you, Julia. My apologies, everyone. We have a slight technical hitch around the presentation, but you will get the full presentation so after the webinar, so you know, you can have a look at all the slides. My apologies to that. So Julia looked at a case scenario for recruitment. We're going to look at the next case scenario now. Cindy, thank you. Yeah. So you receive an anonymous note on your table saying that one of your volunteer managers has been asking some of the female volunteers to stay late with him on his own, and they're not happy with this. So this is just going to think about, so you've recruited somebody as a volunteer, they're now part of the organization, and you receive an anonymous note on your table, you know, as a HR personnel. If you could unmute your mics and let me know, are you concerned about this? And what exactly are you concerned about? Hello? Anyone?
Hello.
Hi, Aneeta. Yeah, I think Garland's just written to say that for him it is a matter of concern. So.
Okay, and Garland, could you just explain why you might be concerned? Garland?
Oh, it's possible that his microphone might not be working.
Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
I think.
Bumi, did you
yeah.
want? Yeah, sorry, I think Bumi may want to say something.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, like I think I'll be seriously concerned. You know, I can't just put it aside like that because of the whole issue. We have a lot of impact in the work we do and what we represent as a mission organization. So I cannot just go and sleep over it and feel that that's all right. So I will be really, really seriously concerned, and I want to take action immediately. Even though I don't know it's an anonymous note, but I won't just let it slip by and leave it like that. So I want to find out if it is true, if it's not true, because I know first it will have a lot of impact on my own reputation as the leader, and as well as the reputation of the mission that I represent. So that's what made me feel concerned. Yeah.
Okay, and what do you think? You know, and your concerns are around what you know, what would you be probably? There are no allegations in that note, right? Again,
No.
I'm just throwing it out. Yeah. So there are no allegations. It's just that they are being, you know, that. So what are the risks about maybe staying late?
Yeah, the point is that I need to investigate more. You know, maybe calling a meeting to say why are people getting late? Is it is there any special work they are doing that leads to that lateness? You know, so I would just want to go with an assumption that I know why. I want to go into what really caused the. So that's why I'm concerned. If they are getting late and maybe getting late in the night and coming out in the office when it is already dark and no one knows what's going on, then I want to know what's happening during the hour. What kind of work is going on within that hour?
Sure.
And if also, even if it's legitimate work going on, if people that are volunteer feel uncomfortable, you know, being around, you know, and they feel so uncomfortable, it means that the work environment is no longer safe. So whether there is abuse that comes from as a result of that, but once people begin to feel uncomfortable, then it's something that one needs to be concerned and then take action on. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So I see that there's lots of thoughts. Yes, go on.
Yes, I think Suma had a comment as well. Suma, do you have a comment?
If you're not able to come online, just write your comments on the box. I can see that here. It's a matter of concern if there's no proper reason behind it. Yes. I want to ask, how could we have prevented rumors in the first place? So again, you've just done a risk assessment exercise. So if you were to do a risk assessment exercise on this, how could we have prevented rumors? How could we have prevented, a volunteer manager asking for female volunteers to stay late? Any thoughts?
For me,
hello, Garland. Yes, hi.
Hi.
Garland? Hi.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Hi. I think first we should have a policy for no late sitting for female volunteers.
No, what? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
We should have a policy for no late sitting.
No late sitting. Okay. So where, if you say something like, no this or yes that, what would that document be called?
It should be in our HR policy manual. It should be a policy.
So if we are saying this is no late sitting for female volunteers,
Yes.
and we're saying that would be inappropriate, what kind of
Yes.
document would that be?
That should be kind of a safeguarding do's and don'ts for female volunteers, and that could be a standard operating procedure kind of a thing in office. Minimum things which we should take care while working together.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yes,
Okay.
Doris also
Yes.
gave the same comment to say that,
Yeah.
if it should be in the handbook about some kind of, I think, a code of conduct, and that's not showing respect of the conduct, and action needs to be taken. And also that there's a high risk of abuse if somebody, especially male, stays with someone late on their own. Thank you.
That's right. So thank you, Doris, and thank you, Garland. Yes, so it should be in the code of conduct. If this is a risk, and you've already thought about this risk, it should be in the code of conduct. Even if it is not in the code of conduct, the code of conduct certainly, or as you say, the standing operating procedures for office times should be already stipulated. If there is special work to be done, then certainly there needs to be permission from senior leaders that such work can happen in the evening or late at night. But certainly a risk assessment around the fact that, say, female volunteers may not be able to get back home late at night, for example. So even though they can stay, there is the issue around, obviously, their transport to and from home. So there's a whole range of risks that could happen, not just the fact that, abuse may or may not happen. And I think Bhumi has already discussed the fact that the organization should respond immediately and not wait for things to happen. The fact is, though, it's an anonymous note. Do we have any concerns around that? Should we say that, because it's anonymous, we shouldn't take any notice of it?
No, we should definitely take it seriously.
Okay, all right. And thank you. And the fact, I think Geeta is saying as well that all volunteers should be made aware of the Safeguarding Code of Conduct. Thank you, Geeta. That's exactly right. So just because they're not staff members does not necessarily mean that they cannot, that they should not be also bound by the same rules and regulations, because these rules and regulations are there to keep each other safe. So thank you for that. Cindy, next slide, please. So third scenario, just for discussion purposes, in exit interviews of female staff from the organization, they often comment how the males are given preferential treatment by the female director. They said that their efforts are often overlooked and they're afraid of her. Are you concerned? And if so, what are you concerned about?
So just for clarity, we're saying that there is a female, perhaps country leader or country director, and this country leader is giving the female staff more better treatment than the male staff. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, the female staff are saying that the female director is given preferential treatment to the males.
Ah, okay, to the males. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, it's not worded very well.
Sorry. Okay.
And the day is the female staff say that their efforts are often overlooked and they're afraid of her.
Okay, thank you.
Are we concerned?
yes, there is a matter of concern because it's discrimination between people, and it's overlooking caliber, their skills, and their contribution. Yes.
Correct.
And,
yeah.
Management and the board should be made aware about it.
Okay. Good. Okay. So already you're thinking about action. So could anything have been done to prevent such discrimination or preferential treatment from happening in the first place?
First, there should be sensitization and very clear laid down procedures should be there.
And what should those procedures say?
Like during recruitment, we should not favor the gender. Okay. And during promotions or during when we assign tasks, there should not be any preferential thing. Assignment should be the caliber of the person, not on the gender. And those things clearly. And if somebody notices that somebody is doing deviation, means they're not taking care of these SOPs, then the first thing is that the person should be told very upfront, clearly on face, that sir or ma'am, you are avoiding these things and it's not acceptable. First thing, you should also be appraised about it.
Okay, thank you. What about the fact that they are afraid of her? What do we know about the culture in the organization?
Yes, culture is there definitely, but unless or until if we break it, the things will continue. If we want to improve, and if we want to stop discrimination, somebody has to raise a voice now.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think also it's interesting in this one because we, given the information we have, we've only heard from the female staff. So it would be interesting to hear from the male staff as well to see if they are feeling the same or if they're actually feeling like they're also being afraid of the line manager. So we're only kind of have got half of the story here.
Okay. And so when we're talking about culture and there is fear, we know that, a culture where there is fear within the organization is an unsafe workplace. And you're right, both Garland and Jane, that, it doesn't only just affect, some members of staff, it will affect all members of staff. So, getting an insight on how the males are looking as well. The reason why I've also developed this case scenario is to understand that the basis of misuse of power, position, and trust, which gives rise to abuse, can also give rise to discrimination. So the basis of that is the fact that if we're not recruiting well, or if we're recruiting with, gendered colored lens, or not thinking about those issues, it can give rise to unsafe workspaces. Okay, so Cindy, next slide, thank you. So I wanted to also let you know about, and you may be familiar with this already, about donor expectations. Here is a pictorial version of DFID's due diligence enhanced standards. So DFID is the Department of International Development. I know for a fact that, the Leprosy Mission of England and Wales receives funding from DFID. DFID had brought out these standards in June 2018. They have now been signed by 22 institutional donors. So this includes Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Australia, the US, right across the board, including Japan. So that does affect many of the TLM offices across the world if you are receiving funding from these donors. Also, the World Bank, the institutional funding agencies have all signed up to the same standards. Under these standards, you will see that there are many areas which affect your responsibility as HR. So firstly, safeguarding on the right. So there are 6 key areas, but certainly for safeguarding is to have a robust policy or policies in place to ensure that there is mandatory training, to ensure that there is a safeguarding register, there is a clear investigation process, there are clear disciplinary processes. That certainly is all within the remit of HR. The second area is whistleblowing. So whistleblowing means that if there are safeguarding concerns, fraud, financial mismanagement, that will be included under whistleblowing. And whistleblowing under TLM, you have agency called SafeCall. You can pick up the phone or email them if you feel that you cannot raise the concerns internally within the organization. So there should be a whistleblowing policy, there should be a training around that. There needs to be a clear complaints process. How can staff complain and what will happen once the complaint has been received? And it's very clear under the DFID's due diligence process that there should be 0 reprisals, which means that whistleblowers should be able to raise their concerns without being afraid that they may be losing their jobs. The third area that obviously concerns HR is the main area of HR, where job description and risk assessments need to take place during recruitment. That selection and interview panels need to be trained in safeguarding when you undertake interviews. And references must be checked. So it doesn't mean that you just receive the reference from 2 or 3 referees, that you actually go back to these referees and you have a conversation with them, 1, to verify that they are a proper referee, and 2, to verify that they actually know the candidate and whether they are able to tell you anything additional on the phone. 4, obviously risk management, but 5 is code of conduct, and that is a key area for HR because it is about inappropriate and appropriate behavior. So all organizations must have a clear code of conduct that prioritizes people. So this includes children, vulnerable people, vulnerable adults, as well as those who represent the organization. Staff and representatives must sign an evidence that they understand the code of conduct, what's appropriate and inappropriate behavior. They need to be trained, and this is where HR will come in as well, the training on the code of conduct, and they need to be clear about what the ethics and the values of the organization are, because that is around the area of behavior. Just to be clear as well that the code of conduct does not only apply to within the workspace. So if you are a TLM staff member between 9 and 5, it doesn't mean when it's 5:30 and you leave the office, you stop being a TLM staff member. The code of conduct is 24/7 and applies within the workspace as well as outside the workspace. Okay, and this applies to volunteers as well. And finally, governance. And again, just to be clear that there needs to be a safeguarding trustee or board member, and that safeguarding has to be a standard agenda item on board meetings. Okay, thank you, Cindy. Next slide, please. So there are some useful links. That was just a whistle-stop tour of the donor compliance, so what donors expect. You can click on these links later on when you receive the slides to read some more. Next slide, please. I've put together a recruitment checklist. This recruitment checklist is not exhaustive. I think it can still be improved. But I thought it might be helpful for you if you are in the midst of either recruiting or supporting managers to recruit, to think about this checklist, and it can help you when it comes to thinking through about safeguarding. Sure. So here are a few, and then I will stop to take any additional questions. Ensure job adverts clearly state the organizational commitment to safeguarding, and that candidates will need to undergo vigorous checks. So remember the barrier. If you put the obstacle high enough, people who have intention of committing abuse within the organization will be prevented from actually applying for jobs if you use this sort of wording. Okay. Ensure that recruitment is gender diverse, so that panels, are not all male or all female panels, recruitment panels. You need to think about gender diversity within recruitment panels, and that they are trained in safeguarding, or they include a HR person trained in safeguarding to ensure safeguarding is thought about and discussed at interviews. Ensure that candidates are sent the safeguarding policy and code of conduct when they're invited for the interview. We are in the midst of revising the safeguarding policy. At the moment, it's far too long. So we are hoping to bring that down to 6 or 7 pages, but certainly they need to know what are the organizational standards around safeguarding, as well as what is the code of conduct. Ensure that candidates are asked safeguarding questions during interviews. Now, these questions can vary, such as, why is safeguarding important? How does it apply to your position? So they should have thought about, about keeping people safe, including themselves, and how they would think about, well, if I got this job, here are a few things that I would be thinking about. Ensure that candidates provide originals of their ID documents and certificates. One of the issues about the area of safeguarding is people move around. If they commit abuse within one organization and they move to the next organization, they could change their names. Or they could actually modify certificates of other people and say that they are that person. So ensure that you see the originals of identification documents and their certificates, and just don't take photocopies of that. Ensure that referees are asked if they have any concerns about the candidate working with children and vulnerable people. Vet references by calling referees and having a conversation. And undertake police checks, or in England it's called a DBS, Disclosure Barring System, on all candidates prior to providing a full offer. Now, I understand that police checks may or may not be useful in some of the contexts that you work in, because that can be easily obtained with a bit of money. What's important though is if this person has direct contact with vulnerable groups, then the risk is higher, as Julia was talking about earlier during risk assessment. Next slide, please. When candidates are in the role, ensure safeguarding training is provided during induction where the organizational values, policies, codes of conduct are properly understood and can be applied. And you saw from the donor compliance that they have to sign the documents to show that they have actually understood them. During probation, pick up any red flags during supervision. So red flags means any concerns around the area of behavior. Pick that up during supervision or during probationary period so that can be addressed quickly. Or that the person doesn't pass probation because of those red flags. Ensure that staff know the various ways that staff and representatives can report safeguarding concerns. Now, this should be clearly displayed in office premises. So if you have a designated safeguarding lead or you are the designated safeguarding lead, that information needs to be clearly displayed in the office so that people know that they can come to you in confidence to raise their concerns. Ensure that managers include time for safeguarding matters to be discussed at team meetings and confidentially in supervision. So safeguarding shouldn't be left to once a year. The odd training or the odd 1 hour or half a day. It needs to be something that we incorporate on a daily basis. Ensure that red flags are picked up at 360 feedback during performance management processes or exit interviews. We need to be looking for patterns of behavior. We need to be looking at if there are areas which are, which put the workplace at risk. Now, again, this is something that can be addressed quickly if it's caught early on. If we allow it to manifest, it could get dangerous. Okay, and ensure consistency of application of investigation and disciplinary process. So what I mean by consistency here is the fact that people need to be seeing that the same process is applied, whether the person's a manager or whether the person is an outreach worker, not that there is any preferential treatment being given. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'll open the floor for questions or comments.